Hello, everyone. It's good to be here with you today. Hopefully you are doing well on this Sunday. Hopefully you had a great Thanksgiving. Feels like it's been forever since I've seen you because this week was just weird. But hopefully you had a great Thanksgiving, and hopefully you just had some time just to give thanks to God for all the good things that He's given to you. Whether that's family or friends or a lot of good food this past week, or just even the grace to just hang on if this season of life has been a difficult season for you. There's just so much to give thanks to God for, and hopefully we've been able to just give Him thanks, especially this past week with Thanksgiving, on Thursday. And so, praise God for that. Thank you for being here, and thank God for all the things that He's given to us. But in addition to those things that I've kind of listed out for us, I've also been realizing more and more that there's something I tend to kind of neglect to give thanks to God for. And it's going to sound a little bit random, but one thing that I've realized is that I very often neglect to give thanks to God for good leaders. I know, really random, but I often forget to give thanks to God for good leaders. But the longer I live, the more I work with people, the more experience that I have, the more I realize just how important good leadership is. And for anyone that's had a bad or terrible boss, you know that this is very true. I just to kind of give an example. The very first job that I had in college, I was working at one of the libraries on campus. I was one of the student workers that you would see in the front as you come in. I would check out your books and all that stuff. And, my job at this library on campus, my supervisor wasn't very good. In fact, he was a pretty terrible boss. You see, he was very passive aggressive, and so if he didn't like you, he wouldn't tell that directly to your face. He wouldn't make suggestions, hey, you should try this better, or you should work on this. Rather, what he would do is, if he didn't like you, he would send you down to this room that we used to call the dungeon. Now, the dungeon was the bottom, this room on the bottom level of the library. And it was the room where all the books that were returned, or all the books that we would collect that people left behind on the tables or the chairs or on the shelves or whatever. And that's the room where all these books, thousands of books, would be collected. And in the dungeon, if you were assigned to the dungeon, your job was to go through literally thousands of books during your shift and organize them alphabetically by call number, all by yourself, in a room that had no windows, right? It was just terrible. Now, for me, as you might, guess, I was a pretty good employee, so I was never really, I was a good employee though, but I wasn't really assigned to the dungeon. But I remember towards the end, when I submitted my 2 weeks notice, like I'm done with this job, I'm moving on, right? When I submitted my 2 weeks notice, my supervisor responded with just one word. He said, okay, right? And for the final 2 weeks of my time at this work-study job, I was sent to the dungeon, right? So every day for all of my shifts, the entire time, I was sent to the dungeon to organize these books by myself in this windowless room, and it was terrible, right? For those of us who've ever had a terrible boss, you know just how important leadership is, right? Leaders can make or break an organization. Leaders can make or break a company. Leaders can make or break a family. Leaders can make or break a community. And to be honest, leaders can make or break a church. Right? Now, leaders aren't everything, right? Churches can rise, churches can fall, and leaders may or may not be a part of that. But having the right kind of leader is important. But not just that, right? Not just having the right kind of leaders, but also being the right kind of leader is important. You see, whether or not you have a formal title or a formal position of leadership, chances are you exert some kind of leadership. Because here's the thing. At the end of the day, leadership is simply influence. If you influence someone, you are exerting leadership. See, leadership is influencing people around you to move towards a certain direction, or to move to accomplish a certain goal, or to have a certain vision of life. Right? Leadership, if you will to boil it down, leadership is influence. And so when you exert influence on others, you are exerting leadership upon others. Right? So leadership shows up in the way that you raise your children. Leadership shows up in the way that you work on your marriage. Leadership shows up in the way that you work on that project with your coworkers or your classmates. Right? Leadership shows up in the ways that you serve here at church. And so the question is not, are you a leader? But are you a good one? Are you a godly leader? Are you the kind of leader that God calls us to be, whether that's at the office or in the home or in your community or here at church or wherever you may be? Are you the kind of leader that God has called you to be? Right? And so that's the main question we want to answer today. Right? What does a godly leader look like? What are the characteristics of leadership that God calls us to take upon in our everyday lives? And that's what we're hoping to explore in our passage for today. See, in the book of Philippians, in our passage, Paul's going to give us two great examples of godly leadership through these two guys named Timothy and Epaphroditus. Right? He's going to bring up these two guys to show us what kind of character godly leaders have and what kind of actions godly leaders take. And so if you have a Bible with you or a bulletin, if you want to turn with me to the book of Philippians, we're continuing our series through this little letter, and we're picking up here in Philippians chapter 2, starting with verse 19. Philippians chapter 2, starting with verse 19. And here, Paul's going to bring up what godly leaders look like, and this is the main idea, the main point for today's sermon. It's simply this: godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. Godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. Or in other words, godly leaders seek out the interest of those around them. Godly leaders are constantly thinking about the needs of those around them. They're constantly trying to figure out, how can I set up those around me to succeed in life, to succeed in this organization, to succeed in their walk with Christ. Right? Godly leaders are constantly thinking about others. Godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. And to talk about that, Paul first brings up the example of his friend named Timothy. And just to fill you in a little bit about, some of the biographies and biblical history here, Timothy was one of Paul's closest friends and disciples. In fact, Paul considered Timothy to be like his own son, right? To be like, his own child. Right? That was the closeness of the relationship that they, had with one another. See, Paul had met Timothy on the first of his 3 missionary journeys while he was visiting the town that Timothy was living in. And there in that town, Paul shared the gospel with Timothy's family, and they became Christians. Now, on Paul's second missionary journey, when he came back around to visit and check up on the people that he preached the gospel to on his first missionary journey, Timothy decides to join Paul on his missionary journeys. See, at the time, Timothy was probably a teenager. That was not unusual. Most teenagers followed someone to learn a craft, or they had an apprenticeship with someone else. And so Timothy, as a teenager, begins to travel with Paul. And by the time we get to our passage here in Philippians chapter 2, it's been about 20 years. Timothy has been following Paul to preach the gospel and start churches and do the work of missions for the past 20 years or so. Right? Timothy was with Paul when Paul first started the church in Philippi, and even now, while Paul is a prisoner in Rome, Timothy is there with him. And here in our passage, Paul brings up Timothy as an example of what a godly leader looks like. And I want you to first notice Timothy's character. I want you to see the internal quality that Timothy carries as a leader. And I want you to see that he has a selfless character. If you take a look at verses 19 to 21, we see this internal quality within Timothy, this selfless character within Timothy. It says this, verse 19 to 21. It says, "I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they are all other leaders, all other people, they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ." See, here we see that the character of a godly leader is one of selflessness. Right? Paul makes it explicitly clear. Timothy takes a genuine interest in others. He has a genuine concern for the welfare of others. That's his character. It's a selfless character. And that's very different than what we experience amongst the way of leadership in our world, right? In our world, leadership is all about look out for myself, get as much as I can for myself, grow my prestige, grow my brand, grow my reputation, grow my wealth. Look out for number one before I look out for others. But when leaders take that kind of approach, when they have that kind of character, that can be devastating to the people around them. Right? Take, for example, in the workplace, when leaders care more about finding their next landing spot for their career, that's when the organization suffers. When leaders care more about themselves, their convenience, their comforts, that's when their families suffer. That's when their children suffer. That's when community suffers. Now, unfortunately, that's how leadership in our world tends to operate. It's a very me-first type of mentality. But not with Timothy. See, Timothy takes a genuine interest in others, and through his example, we see that godly leaders have selfless character. But in addition to that, Paul also points out not just Timothy's character, but the kind of action that Timothy takes. And we see that godly leaders have sacrificial action. So look at verses 22 to 24. It says this, "But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with the Father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope, therefore, to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me, and I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also." We see here that Timothy has a proven track record of doing gospel work with Paul. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, they have been preaching the gospel and starting up churches for the past 20 years. Every step of the way, Timothy has been there with Paul, being a servant for the sake of the gospel. In fact, Timothy was there with Paul when the gospel was first preached at Philippi. He was there with Paul when the people of Philippi were angry at Paul and Timothy for preaching the gospel, when they were persecuted and thrown into jail for preaching the gospel. Timothy was there to see this new church get started. He was there to encourage these new Christians in the face of persecution. He was there to serve them. And all along, Timothy has been this servant for the sake of the gospel. See, here's this young man in the prime of his life. He's probably no older than 35, sacrificing his time, his life, his energy, his resources to really serve others. You know, when we tend to think about leadership, we tend to think that leaders are just way up there and everyone else is way down there. Right? It's the boss who gets the corner office. I get my small little cubicle. Right? Leaders, they call the shots and we do all the work. Right? Leaders are the ones who set the agenda and we're the ones who get our hands dirty. But that's not the way leadership is supposed to work in God's kingdom. That's not what we see with Timothy. Rather, we see that true leaders are servants. They are right there in the middle of it all. They make themselves available to serve others. Godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. And we see that with Timothy. Now, in addition to Timothy, Paul brings up another example of another guy named Epaphroditus. Now, Epaphroditus is probably not as familiar to a lot of you, right? In fact, the reason why is because Epaphroditus is only mentioned here in the book of Philippians. And as far as we can tell, he was not a formal leader in any church. As far as we can tell, he was just a normal church member from Philippi. He seems to be someone who just kind of willingly volunteered to bring this care package to Paul in Rome. Remember, Paul is a prisoner in Rome, and back in the day, if you were a prisoner, they didn't give you anything. And so if you wanted to have food to eat, you needed to have friends and family members on the outside bring food to you. And so Paul's friends in Philippi have decided to send Paul this care package, right? Food and supplies and money to make sure that Paul is going to be okay. And the person who has volunteered himself to bring this care package 800 miles from Philippi to Rome is none other than Epaphroditus. He's volunteered himself to give up months, if not years of his life, to travel all the way to Rome, to stay with Paul while he is in prison, and to make sure that Paul's needs are being met. And here Paul says that Epaphroditus also serves as a good example of what godly leadership looks like. And as with Timothy, I want you to notice Epaphroditus' character. He has the same selfless character that Timothy has. So if you look at verses 25 to 26, Paul writes, "I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and your minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill." This is a weird kind of scenario going on here. See, it seems like as Epaphroditus was carrying this care package all the way to Rome on this very long journey that probably took months to accomplish, he got sick. And really, really, really sick. And back in the day, the fatality rate from any major sickness was really, really high. Now, his friends in Philippi heard news that Epaphroditus was really sick, and they were expecting the worst. They were expecting him to die. Now, here's the crazy part. See, more than being worried about himself, Epaphroditus is worried about his friends. That's crazy. More than being worried about his own sickness, Epaphroditus is worried because his friends are worried sick about his sickness. He's hurting because they are hurting. Right? He's stuck in Rome while everyone back at home is not sure if he's going to make it, and he is genuinely heartbroken over that. And that's incredible. Right? When I am sick, I'm the most selfish person on the planet, right? Feed me, take care of me, give me medicine, right? Make sure that I'm doing okay, take care of me. I get this tunnel vision that only focuses on myself. But Epaphroditus is more concerned that his friends get taken care of. See, a godly Christian leader genuinely cares about others. Your heart moves with your people because their problem is your problem. Their burdens are your burden. Their worries and their concerns are your worries and your concerns. Godly leaders care about their people. They have this selfless character. And we see here that Epaphroditus has that kind of character. But not just that. See, Paul also points out the same pattern of sacrificial action in Epaphroditus. If you look at verses 27 to 30, Paul kind of finishes up this passage talking about Epaphroditus, and he writes this. He says, "Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I'm the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So receive him in the Lord with all joy, and honor such men, honor such leaders, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me." Right, since not all the Philippians could make the journey all the way to Rome, they sent Epaphroditus as their representative, as their messenger. And as we just saw, while he was carrying this care package to Paul, he became really sick. He almost died. And in that, we see that Epaphroditus was willing to sacrifice not just his time, not just his energy, but his very own life to serve those around him. And in that, we see that godly leaders are to take sacrificial action. Now, God may not call all of us to literally lay down our lives for the sake of others. But every Christian, without exception, is called to live lives of self-sacrifice. God calls all Christians, without exception, to be willing to give up certain things in order to serve others. And so, what does that look like? It may look like being willing to open up your home, to invite in that friend, or to invite in that church member or that neighbor, to host them and to serve them, to check in on them, to see how they're doing. It might look like maybe saving up your money to give it away to missions instead of spending it all on that Cyber Monday purchase that you don't really need. And maybe it looks like showing tremendous patience towards that coworker who gets on your nerves, and yet you serve them patiently. You pray for them, you encourage them, you walk alongside them in the office. See, godly leaders are called to be self-sacrificial for the sake of the gospel. They take sacrificial action. So just as a recap, we see here in both Timothy and Epaphroditus good examples of what godly leaders look like. We see that godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. Right? Both these guys show the kind of selfless character and the sacrificial action that godly leadership demands. But now that we've kind of seen this and covered this, I just want to pause here just for a bit. I just want to address maybe some of the objections that may be arising in your minds as you're hearing this sermon. Maybe as you're listening to this, maybe some of you may be thinking, I'm not a leader. I'm too young. I'm in my 20s. I'm in my 30s maybe. I'm no leader. People should be pouring into me. I'm too young to be pouring into others. I'm too young to be leading others. I'm too young. Well, Timothy was also relatively young. In fact, that was such a major issue that Timothy faced, so much so that in another letter that Paul writes to Timothy, a personal letter, he has to encourage Timothy, and he tells him, don't let anyone look down on you because of your age. Don't let anyone look down on you because you are young. But Timothy, set an example for the believers. I don't care if they are 30, 40, 50 years older than you. Set an example for the believers. Age doesn't define godly leadership. Selfless and sacrificial service defines godly leadership. And this goes the other way too, right? Some of you may be thinking, I'm too old to lead. I'm in my 40s, my 50s. My life has kind of gone and passed. I'm too tired. Let others do it. We may need you to lead more than you even know, and you probably have more to offer than you even think. Age doesn't define godly leadership. Selfless and sacrificial service defines godly leadership. Now, others of you may have a different objection kind of rising up in your mind, and you may be thinking to yourself, I'm not a leader. I don't have the right kind of personality to lead. I'm not outspoken. I'm not an extrovert. I'm not that type A, hey, let's go. I'm going to be out in the front calling people to do all these things. I don't have a charismatic presence. Well, neither did Timothy. See, Timothy was known to be someone who was meek and timid. He was shy and soft-spoken. Right? He did not have that kind of type A personality that we so often associate with leaders. And yet, Paul holds Timothy up as an example of godly leadership. See, a charismatic personality doesn't define godly leadership. Selfless and sacrificial service defines godly leadership. Now, others of us in this room may be thinking, okay, I have a different objection, right? Okay, whatever, age, personality, whatever. I'm not a leader because I don't have a formal position of leadership. I don't have a title to my name. I don't have my name on the door. You don't understand. I'm at the bottom of the totem pole at my workplace. Right? In fact, it's not even in my job description to lead. Right? I'm not a leader. I don't have a formal position to lead. Well, neither was that the case for Epaphroditus. See, as far as we can tell, he wasn't a formal elder. He wasn't a formal deacon. As far as we can tell, he was rather just an ordinary church member who served in an extraordinary way. See, a formal position doesn't define godly leadership. Selfless and sacrificial service defines godly leadership. And finally, maybe for some of us in this room, we may be thinking to ourselves, okay, I escaped age, I escaped personality, I escaped position, but Josh, you don't understand. You don't know my past. You don't know the kind of family background that I grew up with. Or I don't come from the right place or the right background to be a leader. If you knew what kind of sins I committed before I became a Christian, you would not want me to be a leader. If you knew the kind of dysfunction that I grew up in with my household, you would not want me to lead. Well, I have news for you. Epaphroditus didn't come from your typical cookie-cutter Christian home. See, based on his name, Epaphroditus probably did not grow up in the church. Rather, based on his name, we can know that he grew up as a pagan. You see, his family worshiped the goddess Aphrodite, and their devotion to the goddess Aphrodite was so great that they named their son Epaphroditus, which literally means favored one of Aphrodite. Epaphroditus was not a Christian boy. He grew up as a pagan. And as a pagan, he grew up in a household that offered countless sacrifices to the goddess Aphrodite. As a pagan, he committed tremendous acts of idolatry, things that would probably make us blush. And yet somehow, by the grace of God, somewhere along the way, Epaphroditus came to Christ. And Paul says that Epaphroditus serves as a good example of what godly leadership looks like. Friends, your past doesn't define godly leadership. Selfless and sacrificial service defines godly leadership. We see here that godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. It's not your age. It's not your personality. It's not your position. And it is not your past. Rather, it's whether or not you have this selfless character. It's rather whether or not you have the kind of sacrificial action. That's what makes you a godly leader. Not your age, not your preferences, not your position, not your personality, not any of that, not your past, but whether or not you take selfless and sacrificial servanthood to seriousness in your life. Now, if you've been with us for the past few Sundays, as we've been going through the book of Philippians, you might be thinking to yourself, okay, this is good stuff, but this all sounds really, really repetitive. I feel like I've heard this already before, and to that I say, thank you for paying attention to the sermons because you are absolutely correct. This is repetitive. Timothy and Epaphroditus embody what we've been talking about for the past 3 to 4 sermons. They exhibit the kind of lives that are in line with gospel citizenship. They have the kind of lives that are in line that matches up with Christ's incarnation and Christ's crucifixion. In other words, they embody the kind of humility that we've been talking about for the past 3 to 4 weeks. And so, yes, Paul seems to be repeating himself here. Right? This is very repetitive. Now, I don't think Paul is just adding this to kind of fluff up his letter or to meet some sort of word count that he has to reach. But rather, I think Paul brings up Timothy and Epaphroditus as examples because he's doing something very insightful here. I think he's doing something so insightful in bringing up these examples of these two godly leaders because here's the thing. Godly leadership is more caught than taught. Godly leadership is more caught than taught. And what I mean by that is this. Yes, these Philippians can learn a lot through receiving abstract information from Paul, right? I would love to receive abstract information directly from Paul. They can get great theology from Paul. They can fill their heads with all the right ideas, all the right doctrines, all the right things, but it's a whole new ballgame when they see godly leaders modeled in front of their very eyes. See, they can know about godly leadership, and that is helpful, but it's more helpful to know godly leaders. And so, yes, Paul does teach the Philippians what godliness is, but Paul also shows the Philippians what godliness looks like. And he does so by bringing up the examples of Timothy and Epaphroditus. These are flesh and blood examples of what godly leadership looks like. These are leaders whom they know, whom they trust, whom they love, whom they've shared life with and spent time with together. See, godly leadership is more caught than taught. Just as an example from my own life. When I think back to my own personal life, I don't really remember my parents sitting me down to lecture me or talk to me about stewardship or service or hospitality all that much. I don't really recall that many lectures between my parents and me talking about those things. But those things are core values to me, not because they've lectured me about that, but because I've seen them open up their home every Thanksgiving to invite people who have nowhere else to go to come and enjoy a meal together as a family. It's because I've seen them give generously time and time again to those who are in need. Now, that's not to say that we should never teach about godly leadership. I think sermons are important. I think Bible studies are important. But that is to say that godly leadership is more caught than taught. And so here's the application for you. See, your children don't just need you to tell them, hey, say sorry to your sibling for hitting them. Rather, your children also need to see you saying sorry to them for every time that you mess up or for the goofs or the mistakes that you make. See, your fellow church members don't just need you to preach to them that serving is important, but they also need to see you serving alongside them as you serve those around you. So your coworkers don't just need to know that you are a Christian in the workplace, but they also need to see you living your life out as a Christian in the workplace. So when it comes to godly leadership, godliness is more caught than taught. We model it in the way that we live. And the bottom line is this. Godly leaders look like Jesus. Godly leaders look like Jesus. In God's kingdom, godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants just like Jesus, the ultimate selfless and sacrificial servant. What that means is this. If you don't look like Jesus, you will have failed in your leadership. If we don't act like Jesus, have a character like Jesus, then we will have failed in our leadership. It doesn't matter how many people follow us. It doesn't matter how great our influence is. It doesn't matter how much money we make or what kind of position or title that we have. It doesn't matter what kind of degrees that we possess. If we do not look like Jesus, we will have failed in our leadership because in God's kingdom, godly leaders are selfless and sacrificial servants. And so the question is not so much, are you a leader? But are you a good one? Are you a godly leader? Are you a leader who looks like Jesus? And if you are to be a leader who looks like Jesus, you must be a leader who looks to Jesus. For it's only in seeing Jesus and resting in his gospel, seeing the fullness of his selfless and sacrificial service for us, shown to us in his incarnation, in his crucifixion, in his resurrection, and how he daily ministers to us by his Spirit and his word. It's only in looking to Jesus that we will begin to look like Jesus. And so as you exert leadership in your homes, with your marriages, with your kids and your children, as you exert leadership in your workplaces, in your schools, in your campus ministries, in your campus organizations, or wherever you are, look to Jesus so that you can look like Jesus. As we've seen what godly leadership is supposed to look like, I hope that we would continue to grow to look more like Jesus in our leadership. And whether we find ourselves in a formal position of leadership or not, I hope that we would exert godly influence wherever we are, whether that's at home or with our friends, with our company, wherever we may be. I hope that we would exert this godly leadership. And ultimately, I hope that we would be the kind of godly leaders that point others towards the greatest godly leader, Jesus Christ himself. And so while our coworkers and classmates and family members may not be able to see Jesus, they can see us. And in seeing us, may they catch a glimpse of the one who is the ultimate selfless and sacrificial servant. May we look like Jesus as we look to Jesus. If you can bow your heads with me as we spend some time in prayer and reflection, as we respond to God's word together. Would you just take a moment to think through all the different areas of life that God has given to you as an opportunity to exert godly leadership? You are a leader. God has called you to be a leader. The question is, are you a godly one? Right? Maybe your leadership is going to be exerted with your kids or in your marriage or a dating relationship. Right? Maybe it's with your small group or your community group. Maybe it's with your coworkers or classmates or a campus organization. Would you ask God to mold you to become more like Jesus in your leadership, to really embody the selfless and sacrificial service that we see in him? Spend some time in prayer as we respond to God's word this time.